we go. All right. My name is Brian. Thanks for joining us tonight. Honestly, I lost track how many days we're at now. Is this 12, 13? We have 12 days left. And we're going to continue looking at the 2024 legislative package, breaking down the other half of Title III and spelling out the other half of how exactly we fulfill our endless and end the endless wars plank. Starting tomorrow, we'll get into the next title, look at healthcare reform, and the next week we'll look at unconditional basic income, how we end poverty. And we spent that first week looking at the criminal justice reforms. All these things come from the Constitution and the goals that the framers laid out for us. And so to remind ourselves of that, we start these sessions off by reciting the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. All right, how can we do these things? Congress is dropping the ball. So we, the people, can help them get their act together. We can do that by unionizing as swing voters and presenting one set of demands across all 470 congressional races, federal races, and with one set of demands. Say, look, Congress, get this done, and we let you keep your jobs. Refuse to act and face the consequences on November 5th. Go big or go home. This is how we can create the tension that Dr. King spoke of, where the issue cannot be avoided, where we can create a situation where the government finds it to be wise and prudent to collaborate with us. Dr. King's lessons are very much a part of the American Union model, as we talked about last night with nonviolence. But during his day, he was very opposed to the endless war of Vietnam. And he spoke out against it, despite the fact that many people could not recognize the connection between the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. So, you gotta pick a lane. You gotta keep these things separate. Don't distract people. But the truth is, they are very much connected. And we talked about duties last night. So the sort of the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated. And some of our foreign policies, as we're going to talk about tonight, are very much stray from that duty. We do not treat others the way that we would want to be treated. And in fact, the way that we treat others may in fact be a way that Americans are not aware of. There's a lot of things going on in the world, and foreign policy isn't always the sexiest topic. So I appreciate you joining me tonight to look at the rest of Title III. And let's go ahead and start with Section 331. So where we left off on Tuesday night was with we're getting ready to get into the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. And so, pull this up. We are going to start off with the findings and purpose. Findings and purpose. Well, let me just read those. Okay. On July 27th, 1953, the Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command signed an armistice agreement with the Supreme Commander of the North Korean People's Army and the Commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers, aiming to ensure a complete cessation of hostilities and all acts of armed force in Korea until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. 1953. So do the math. So we're talking more than 70 years. So point number 2, the armistice agreement neither formally ended the war nor represented a final peaceful settlement. Number 3, on April 27, 2018 in Pyongyang, leaders of South Korea and North Korea declared that A new era of peace has begun on the Korean Peninsula and committed to declare the end of war on the Korean Peninsula 65 years after the signing of the armistice. In its rollout of policy toward North Korea, the Biden administration expressed support for the Singapore Framework, which identifies peace on the Korean Peninsula as an objective of any future negotiations between the United States and North Korea. 5. The United States should pursue a sustained and credible diplomatic process to achieve an end to the Korean War, and every effort should be made to avoid military confrontation with North Korea. 6. The presence of a state of war does not serve the national interests of the United States and its allies. 7. One major consequence of the continuation of the Korean War is that the United States does not have formal relations with North Korea, which has prevented Korean Americans with relatives in North Korea from seeing their families. 8. Approximately 100,000 Americans have relatives living in North Korea. 9. At the Hanoi Summit in February 2019, the United States and North Korea discussed formally ending the Korean War and the exchange of diplomatic liaison offices. However, these discussions did not advance due to a stalemate on nuclear and missile issues. 10. The ongoing nuclear and ballistic missile-related activities of North Korea continue to pose a threat to international peace and security. The purpose of this part is to identify a path that will bring an end to the endless war on the Korean Peninsula. Now, most of this language comes from legislation introduced by Representative Brad Sherman of California, who has a lot of Korean constituents. And as these findings pointed out, and they lay out sort of the problems that are all addressed over the next few sections, starting with, I'll show my screen here, starting with section 332, which is the humanitarian consideration regarding visiting North Korea. Because of those 100,000 Americans who have relatives in North Korea, it is the sense of Congress that this warrants a review by the Secretary of State. And that's subsection A. Subsection B, Secretary of State shall conduct a full review of the restrictions in place and include the following: guidance of the nature of travel, including whether the scope of travel should be adjusted, compelling humanitarian conditions, and what about purposes of things like witnessing funerals, burials, other religious and family commemorations of relatives, and if they should qualify for compelling humanitarian considerations. The Secretary of State shall submit a report on this within 6 months of enactment, and it should be submitted in an unclassified form but may contain a classified annex. Yeah, so that's section 332. Oh, there's something I'm going to add, but my notes are not loading here. Yeah, all right, I guess that's it. Let's move on to section 333, calling for a formal end to the Korean War. Once again, sense of Congress that the United States should pursue serious diplomatic engagement with North Korea and South Korea in pursuit of a binding agreement constituting a formal and final end to the state of war. Once again, within 6 months, the Secretary of State shall submit a report which shall A, contain an accounting of steps necessary to enter into negotiations, B, identify the key stakeholders involved in negotiations, and C, describe the challenges concerning the ability of the United States to achieve a binding peace agreement. Again, lay out a process to move us forward on what the sense of Congress is that after 70 years, it's time to end the Korean War. Do we think this is going to go on for another 70 years? At some point, it's going to have to stop, right? So let's do it. Literally, what are we waiting for? We waited for 70 years. What are we waiting for? Well, we're waiting for the political will to be generated to prompt discussion, negotiation, and an end to this war. So we, the people, can generate the political will to do that. Yeah, 70 years. All right, moving on. Section 334, establishing liaison offices. Again, we're not talking to North Korea in the way we should be if we wanted to actually end the Korean War. So one of the things that we can do is establish liaison offices because we don't have formal relations with them. So this directs the Secretary of State to enter into negotiations for doing just that. There is not a specific or timetable requirement, but it directs the Secretary of State to do that. Section 335 is just the rule of construction. It just says this, foreign policy has a lot of nuance, and so nothing in this part should be construed to affect the status of the United States Armed Forces stationed in South Korea or any other foreign country. All right, that is pretty straightforward. All right, moving on. Now we're on to subtitle B. Improving America's moral standing in the world. And first up, we've got section 341, prohibition on first use nuclear strikes. Yeah, so we spent a lot of time on Tuesday talking about nuclear weapons and how part of the legislative package, the Trump-Biden peace plan, will cut America's stockpile by 50% by the end of 2029. And how we would not kick off a new arms race, that instead of upgrading our missile systems, we would maintain the ones that we have already, ICBMs. This language here in section 341, it comes from a piece of legislation introduced in the House, HR 669, back in 2021. And so basically this is how you set policy. Congress holds the purse strings, and so Congress can prohibit any federal funds that would conduct a first use strike unless it is pursuant to a war declared by Congress that expressly authorizes such strike. Once again, Congress has the power to declare war. That's the framework that the framers laid out for us. And so Congress has not stood up for its duties in many recent decades. But ultimately, it is their constitutional duty. And so this section would very clearly make it so that Congress would have to establish this policy that we would, as we did in World War II, use nuclear weapons, atomic weapons on another country without having been attacked first. Now, I should say this policy is sort of the unofficial policy of the United States, but we can make it an official one. Again, we talked last night about duties of nonviolence and leading by example. Except, to be fair, we would not actually be leading by example here because there is another nuclear power that specifically has adopted this no first use policy, and that's China. China has had a no first use policy for many years. Okay, seeing no questions in the chat, we're going to move on to section 342, restricting the use of economic sanctions. Actually, strike that. I'm going to go ahead and read the findings from this, the legislation that the that Section 341 is taken from. And it sort of sums up these points. One, the Constitution gives Congress the sole power to declare war. Two, the framers of the Constitution understood the monumental decision to go to war, which can result in massive death and the destruction of civilized society, must be made by the representatives of the people and not by a single person. Three, as stated in Section 2C of the War Powers Resolution, the constitutional powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief to introduce United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to one, a specific declaration of war. Two, specific statutory authorization. Three, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. Four, nuclear weapons are uniquely powerful weapons that have the capability to instantly kill millions of people, create long-term health and environmental consequences throughout the world, directly undermine the global peace, and put the United States at existential risk from retaliatory nuclear strikes. Five, the first use of a nuclear strike carried out by the United States would constitute a major act of war. Six, a first-use nuclear strike conducted absent a declaration of war by Congress would violate the Constitution. Seven, the President has sole authority to authorize the use of nuclear weapons, an order which military officers of the United States must carry out in accordance with their obligations under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Eight, given its executive power under the Constitution to declare war, Congress must provide meaningful checks and balances to the President's sole authority to authorize the use of a nuclear weapon. And so that's what Section 341 would do. There are lots of good reasons to not use nuclear weapons, but one more safeguard, again, improving America's moral standing in the world by saying, look, we're not going to do this first, as a matter of public policy. It's a matter of human policy, saying these sorts of weapons should not be used lightly, and we're not going to do it. Section 342 brings us to another type of weapon that should not be used lightly, and yet the United States is using it, and that is economic sanctions. Let me stop sharing screen here because, before we get into that. All right, so first let's answer the question, what are economic sanctions? Well, in a recent presentation, Margaret Flowers defined them as unilateral coercive economic measures. And she pointed out they shouldn't be called sanctions because, quote, technically the sanctions imposed by the U.S. are not sanctions, but unilateral coercive measures. Sanctions imply there was a legal process employed that found a country, group, or individual in violation of a law, and that entity was then punished using sanctions. That's the point. That we talked about civil asset forfeiture recently, and civil asset forfeiture has a similar process where there's not really a process, but you still have the opportunity of, when somebody takes your stuff with civil asset forfeiture, you still have an opportunity to go to court and prove that you should deserve your stuff back. Unilateral economic sanctions are unilateral. There is no process in place. There is no opportunity for a country to say, we'd like to appeal your unilateral sanctions. There is no appeal because there is no process. And so that is the difference between what we're doing and the economic sanctions that the UN, United Nations, puts together. That's one. Another part of this is that when you apply sanctions to a whole country, it is a form of collective punishment. Because we're going to punish all of you. Now, unless a country is a perfect democracy, you are punishing innocent people. You are punishing the women. You are punishing civilians. And for civilians, economic violence can be more deadly than military force, right? If you declare war on a country, theoretically, it's going to be the soldiers that that country puts forward that get killed. And when it comes to economic violence, economic sanctions, that targets these civilian populations. You can see the effect of sanctions on North Korea because they are visibly shorter because of the malnourishment as a result of being cut off from world markets. They are visibly shorter than their relatives in South Korea. The United States sanctions against Iran. They escalate inflation, which impacts family budgets across the nation. I kind of think of sanctions as being like a reverse UBI. Those with the least resources get hurt the most by broad economic sanctions. Another way that sanctions impact a country is that when we designate a national security threat, like we've done to Venezuela, this is like a public notice that they're under investigation, and it discourages businesses from investing in it, right? If you're up for a job and the police say, oh, well, we're investigating him for a murder, then that makes you much less likely to get the job. And so, once again, sanctions have a broad range of impact. According to the website, sanctionskill.org, as of October 2022, the was imposing sanctions on Afghanistan, Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Central African Republic, China, Congo, Cuba, Cyprus, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Guinea, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Laos, Lebanon, Liberia, Libya, Mali, Moldova, Montenegro, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Palestine, Paraguay, Russia, Serbia, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, Uganda, Venezuela, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. That is an awful lot of sanctions. A lot of these are African countries, which are generally economically impoverished, on the lower end of the economic ladder to begin with. And so the United States is exacerbating economic issues through these sanctions. Okay, so, and the big one, of course, is Cuba, right? Cuba has been under an embargo, been sanctioned. U.S. companies are prohibited from doing business with them, all that. This is all in response to the 1959 Cuban Revolution. And 5 out of 6 Cubans today weren't even alive in 1959. And yet they are all suffering the economic consequences of something that happened in the 1950s under President Eisenhower. Before John, this has gone on for an awful long time. And the United Nations has repeatedly introduced resolutions recognizing the, quote, and necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. They have done this 31 years. For 31 years, they have introduced these resolutions, and the rest of the planet overwhelmingly agrees. Last year, the vote was 187 in favor, with only the United States and Israel opposed. 187 to 2. When we talk about improving America's moral standing on the world stage, this is a good example. It says when the rest of the planet agrees that what we are doing is wrong, we should listen. During the pandemic, Mexico wanted to send humanitarian relief. They want to send ventilators to Cuba. Only American ships would not cooperate. American carriers, commercial carriers, said, nope, we're not going to help. We can't help. The United States doesn't want us to. So Mexico had to use one of their naval vessels to get the humanitarian supplies there. And it's time to lift the embargo of Cuba, like the Korean War. It is long past time. These are not policies that we are sitting down with today to see, are they appropriate? Are they justified? Are they working? Like, what is the point? What is the point of sanctions? And in theory, the purpose of sanctions is the same purpose as any sort of punishment, right? To reform, to dissuade, or to punish any sort of criminal penalty. And so at this point, we're left with just the punishment. That we're not in a moral position to continue doing this. So let us look at what this legislative language does and exactly how we can improve America's moral standing by changing our policy. All right, restricting the use of economic sanctions, section 342. So a lot of this is in this section, and so we're going to go through and make a number of amendments. Strike these sections, and instead, sorry, we're gonna. What we got here? All right, we're gonna strike the prohibition on directly or indirectly. Lift the prohibition on exports of goods and services. Yes, lifting that. Leaving the freezing assets. Again, assets are held by, we often target individuals or nations, but sometimes that can still be problematic, but this legislation still leaves that option in place. And we got section D2, the president, what we got here? Well, sorry, my notes say that, oh, sorry. I don't know, my notes say there's something in here that allows the president to declare exemptions, but I'm not seeing it at the moment. All right. All right. So we're going to add a new definition for unilateral economic sanction. This is matching the existing unilateral economic sanctions and unilateral medical sanctions that are already prohibited under U.S. law. And so we're going to add another type of unilateral sanction, which is an economic sanction. One that means any prohibition, restriction, or condition on non-specific imports or exports with respect to a foreign country that is imposed by the United States for reasons except, these are the exceptions, except as part of a multilateral regime or other members and the other member countries of that regime have agreed to impose substantially equivalent measure or a mandatory decision by the United Nations Security Council. So a UN imposed sanction we can go along with. Or as part of something that's not unilateral, I guess is the thing. All right, so then we're adding this to the existing law, where the president wants to do it, he has to describe current actions by the foreign country or foreign entity that justify imposing the sanctions. As opposed to saying, well, a bad thing happened in the 1950s, and so we need to just continue this policy without reasoning. And the and so then this would these would be terminated, just like the authorizations for military force that we talked about. Congress could, they could be reinstated, but they would not just continue automatically. Continuing the part here of an automatic sunset within 2 years, including that along with the unilateral economic sanction and unilateral medical sanctions. These sections 7205 and 7207 are prohibitions on the United States' assistance to Cuba and Afghanistan. And then subsection F here clarifies that this chapter shall be construed to nullify the provisions that put restrictions on trading with Cuba. So that is how that section would work. See no question in the chat. We're going to move on to section 343, prohibition on landmines. I'm just gonna I'll go ahead and just, well, yeah, well, let's just read these real quick. All right. Once again, like we did with the no first use policy, this is a prohibition on using federal funds, and you can't use them to develop, produce, or acquire anti-personnel landmines, export or transfer them, except when you're destroying them. And then paragraphs 3, 4, and 5 allow for a temporary exemption to use them allow the United States to continue to use them for the defense of the Republic of Korea. So in the Korean War. Once again, this would be a 5-year exemption. And hopefully it would be less than that because we're trying to negotiate peace with on the Korean Peninsula. The Secretary of Defense shall ensure the total destruction of all anti-personnel landmines. All right. Well, let's talk about landmines for a minute. That policy that we just read is pretty much what the United States policy is right now. That is, President Biden has made that, as Commander-in-Chief, made that the policy as Commander-in-Chief, as our Chief Executive. The problem is that, as we've talked about on other provisions, is that he's not going to be the President of the United States for too much longer. And so that policy can change. And in fact, that is what has happened in the past. President Obama, he said about pretty much the same policy. Donald Trump reversed it, and then Joe Biden reversed it again. So once again, what does the rest of the world think about this? Well, the rest of the world, 164 nations, are party to the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty. It is a legally binding international agreement that bans the use, production, stockpiling, and transfer of anti-personnel landmines. So let's talk about landmines. Like, what are the problems with landmines? They're sort of a way of salting the earth, of burying them in the ground, as to make that section of the planet potentially uninhabitable, unusable. They're a violation of humanitarian law. They are indiscriminate and inhumane weapons. Landmine Monitor reports that civilians, once again, these are weapons that harm civilians, They account for 70 to 85% of casualties. There are countries around the world where children who perhaps are chasing their soccer ball and are horribly maimed. Landmines do not distinguish between civilian and military targets. And so any injuries that are inflicted should be proportionate with military objectives. And when 70 to 85% are hitting non-military targets, then clearly we're doing something wrong. These weapons are doing something wrong. So when the Mine Ban Treaty was adopted, when it was even being negotiated, the United States started negotiating, and then it backed out. And the main reason it said that it backed out was for Korea. Once again, something that happened back in the 1950s, and we got landmines on the border, and in North Korea, you can't come out until you say you're sorry. Yeah, so the United Nations adopted this treaty in 1997. The International Committee to Ban Landmines even got the Nobel Peace Prize for their work. And it is a treaty. It would require 2/3 in the U.S. Senate to ratify it, which you cannot do through a piece of legislation like the Trump-Biden peace plan. It's a special thing. So ratifying the treaty is not something that we can just tuck in. It's not a policy that we can tuck into a piece of legislation. But in 2010, 58 Democrats and 10 Republicans signed a letter asking President Obama to bring it forward, to ask the Senate to ratify. You can do the math. 58 plus 10 is 68. That is more than 2/3 of the Senate. But it didn't come forward. It didn't get ratified by the Senate. And so that laid the groundwork for Donald Trump to reverse the policy when he was president. And once again, we have good policy in place right now, but let's codify it into law to make sure it stays that way. International Committee to Ban Landmines, they say the mines on the Korean Peninsula are no longer under U.S. responsibility, that they've been turned over to the South Korean Armed Forces. And so they say these mines do not and should not prevent the U.S. from joining the Mine Ban Treaty. So, okay, seeing no questions in the chat. Now we're going to move on to section 344, prohibition on lethal autonomous weapons systems. So lethal autonomous weapons, well, if you're familiar with the Terminator franchise, you know what a lethal autonomous weapon system is. These sorts of things that we're seeing more and more with the combination of drones and artificial intelligence. A couple of years ago, Israel assassinated a top Iranian nuclear scientist, November 27th, 2020, using a remote-controlled AI-assisted machine gun. The Russian military, they fly self-destructing drones into Ukraine. And are these the future of warfare? They could be. So once again, the United States, who has the largest military footprint on the planet, can take the opportunity to say, let's not go down this road. Let's not start a new arms race. And the United States can once again lead by example. There's a number of problems with lethal autonomous weapons, and the website autonomousweapons.org offers seven different points. One is that they are unpredictable, and as many millions of us have used AI, things like ChatGPT, we know that sometimes these things hallucinate, that they think things are real that aren't really real. And, that's perhaps funny when lawyers use ChatGPT to write their court documents that hallucinate all sorts of citations that aren't real. Might be funny. But when it comes to weapons that are lethal, that have the power to take human life, we don't need any hallucinations. We need human beings in control of making those decisions. Second reason is escalation. Sometimes you see this on the stock market, where lots of trades on the stock market are done by computers, by automation, and where if such and such happens, then they'll trade, or they'll sell, they'll buy, they'll sell, whatever. And sometimes the stock market does really wacky things when one of these formulas gets triggered, and when it gets triggered, it triggers other ones, and you'll see these prices shoot up, down suddenly. Lethal autonomous weapons have that same risk of rapid escalation. 3 is proliferation. Right? The more of these weapons that there are, the more likely that they will end up in the hands of dictators and terrorists. When it comes to nuclear weapons, they are in only the hands of a few nations, and to the best of our knowledge, not in the hands of any terrorists. But if you could walk into your local big box store and buy a nuclear weapon, then it seems much more likely that terrorists would be able to get their hands on them. So by prohibiting mass development, mass production of these things, will reduce the proliferation of their use. Some of the other problems with lethal autonomous weapons is the lower barriers to conflict. It would be cheaper to start fights, right? If you have 1,000 machine guns, well, then you need 1,000 people to fire those machine guns to be your army. But if you've got 1,000 drones, killer drones, lethal autonomous weapons, you may only need a handful of people to control all 1,000 of these lethal autonomous weapon systems. And so it makes it much cheaper to start the fight in that sense, as well as in you don't run that same risk of, if you got the Terminators fighting for you, then you don't have that same risk of loss of your human soldiers, which presumably have families and things back home that will then advocate against the war when their loved ones are killed. But lethal autonomous weapons do not leave, don't come home in caskets. Mass destruction. I guess this is sort of the same thing. One person, many weapons. 6 is selective targeting of groups. Again, artificial intelligence gives us the capability to discriminate. We've seen the problems that facial recognition software has many times in identifying blacks, misidentifying them. There's a number of cases of people being arrested, incarcerated because of bad facial recognition software, incorrect identifications. And so when you couple that with lethal autonomous weapon systems, you have the opportunity is not the right word, but it's the first one that comes to mind. You have an opportunity to target people by their age, their gender, their race, their ethnicity, even their religious dress. Go find someone who looks like this and kill them. This is not the kind of weapon that the United States should be promoting for use. Last but not least is an AI arms race, in these lethal autonomous weapons. The very definition of a race is focusing on speed instead of safety. And once again, when it comes to these sorts of systems and all the things that can go wrong, that is not a good dynamic. Safety first, not speed. They also argue that autonomous weapons that target humans would violate the Martens Clause. It's a provision of international humanitarian law that establishes a moral baseline for judging emerging technologies. These systems would violate the dictates of public conscience and undermine the principles of humanity because they would be unable to apply compassion or human judgment to decisions to use force. All right, there's always cases, stories like this in war, where soldiers come across an enemy, the enemy, and use human judgment to maybe not kill someone who's wounded and can't fight back. Which is why it is vitally important that it be humans making these sorts of decisions, because humans have judgment, humans have compassion, and we should not make a decision to turn life and death decisions over to machines. The International Red Cross has adopted a position where they recommend states regulate lethal autonomous weapons. And their three core pillars are no human targets, restrict unpredictability, and require human control. So with that, I think we're going to look at the language. Some of this language comes from the Autonomous Weapons Systems, a road mapping exercise, which is a 2019 paper published on Georgia Tech's Robot Lab website. And yeah, I'll share the screen here. All right. In this section, develop means the act or process of creating and includes designs that enable conversion from compliant to non-compliant categories solely by software updates. 2, lethal autonomous weapon system. That means a weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. No federal funds may be obligated or expended to develop, produce, or acquire lethal autonomous weapons systems. Yeah. All right. Again, as we all know, AI is growing by leaps and bounds. And so the best time to address this, to set standards, was 5 years ago, right? But the second best time is today. We can get this done today. Congress has the ability to set national policy. They're willfully refusing to do it. So we're going to give them the opportunity to do so by giving them the opportunity to enact the Trump-Biden peace plan before the November election and win the endorsement of the American Union. And yeah, we'll just close that section with the quote by Sarah Connor in the Terminator movies, right? There is no fate but what we make. We can fix this problem. All right, seeing no questions in the chat, or move on to section 345. Closing Guantanamo Bay military prison. This is, once again, a moral stain on the United States. We have, well, what happened is, after September 11th, just a few months after that, on January 11th, 2002, you had 20 hooded men show up at Guantanamo Bay military prison in Cuba, and they were the first of about 780 exclusively men who were ultimately detained inside of Guantanamo Bay. And after 20 years, there's still 30 of them there. So there's, we talked about, I think we talked about this briefly in the night on polling. There are financial costs to this. It cost, last price tag I saw was $540 million a year for 30 people. $540 million a year for 30 people, so more than $17 million each. It's an awful lot of money to make ourselves look bad on the world stage. But one of the advantages of Guantanamo Bay is that it is outside the boundaries of the United States. And so the Supreme Court has ruled that traditional legal protections don't necessarily apply there because it's not in the United States. And so that's the perk of paying $17 million per person versus the $78,000 a year that it costs to incarcerate someone in a maximum security Bureau of Prisons prison in the United States. 78,000 versus 17 million. So some of these men have been there for 2 decades without ever being charged with a crime. Right? This is a national embarrassment that when our kids pledge allegiance to a flag with liberty and justice for all, clearly that is not justice to detain someone for decades and never charge them with a crime. The framers were familiar with this concept. And so in Article 1, Section 9, the Constitution states, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Jefferson, he called the protections provided by habeas corpus one of the essential principles of our government. And so once again, this is the moral cost of keeping Guantanamo Bay open after 2 decades, is we are violating the essential principles of our government. And it's well known. You have people from ambassadors, officials from around the globe, from Russia, from Pakistan, from Libya, from Sudan, from Iran, that have all criticized us. They've criticized us. They have taken the moral high ground when it comes to Guantanamo Bay. And they can look down on us because of this. It's time to close Guantanamo Bay after 20 years. So we're down to 30 people there, 30 men who are still being held there. And 16 of them, most of them, have been cleared to leave. They are free to go, except we don't let them go. Some of them have been cleared for more than a decade, and they're still not allowed to actually leave. They're just stuck there. And how do we get this unstuck? Well, we're going to direct the closure of Guantanamo Bay military prison. Yeah. John Oliver, he did a special on Gitmo a while back, and so he put it this way. When you see a bumper sticker that says freedom isn't free, this is what it means. Standing up for our highest ideals, even when it requires accepting a certain amount of risk. The risk is that, well, if we didn't just indefinitely detain these people, they might attack the United States. And there's a non-zero chance of that. But freedom isn't free. So we accept that risk and instead live up to what Jefferson called the essential principles of our government. All right, it is 8 o'clock. Let me pull up this text and then we'll call it a night. All right, closing Guantanamo Bay military prison. President shall close it within 6 months, and no funds shall be used after that. And we've got some exceptions. Amounts appropriated or otherwise made available for fiscal year 2025 will be may be used to transfer any incarcerated, the detainees, transfer them to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, right in the middle of the United States. Not really a place that foreign nationals are going to sneak into and break out of, break people out of. All right, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and it could be anyone who has been charged anyone who is charged with, under the Military Commissions Act, a felony offense, or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So they actually have to be, they can be there for pretrial detention, detention during a trial, or while serving a sentence. But they have to be engaged in a legal process, a criminal process, moving towards, with actual charges and a process of getting to a conviction. They cannot just be held indefinitely. Provided that any detention complies with Section 415 of Title 18. You might recognize this. This is our prohibition on restrictions, reformations on solitary confinement. Again, solitary confinement is over more than 15 days is defined as a form of torture by the United Nations. So we'll make sure that these protections apply to everyone that the United States incarcerates. Continue detention at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility for until another 4 months, if it's certified that they need additional time. And if you don't transfer them you can also use funds to transfer anyone to another country, provided that it complies with the Convention relating on the status of refugees and the Convention against torture, that the individual being transferred, who asserts a well-founded fear of torture, abuse, or persecution, has an opportunity to have their claim heard. And if we're not doing that, just a release of any other person. Transfer of an individual to 411 shall not be considered entry for purposes of immigration status. Congress may, by separate legislation after the enactment of this act, amend the destination. If you want to pick a different prison, that's fine, but Fort Leavenworth is the default. And an authorization for appropriation. All right. That concludes that section. Tomorrow we're going to get into Title IV, promote the general welfare, starting with the healthcare provisions. And I think that's it. I'm a little tired tonight. Yeah, I didn't stay super hydrated. So my fast, I'm on day 13 now. My weight is down to 185 pounds. So I'm down 20 pounds. I'm not, yeah, I'm muddling through. But, all right, well, thanks everybody. And I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. for Title IV.